Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 60, Calamity Jane, Little Bighorn, and the Compromise of 1877. All I ever wanted to do was be the Anthony Bourdain of history. What he did for food, I wanted to do for history. Part journalist, part critic, and all renegade, he roamed the earth, illuminated a myriad of cultures and the food they consumed. His shows like No Reservation or Parts Unknown took food and made it informative and sexy. His aura was cool and respected as he dissected dishes across the globe. He, indeed, was a global phenomenon. His passing in 2018 left a giant hole in my heart, as it did for many. Of all things I miss dearly is how he wrote. Seriously, Kitchen Confidential should be required reading. He was indeed the maestro of the page, and his words chewed through me and left me considerably impressed. I selfishly and almost hear Satan laugh joyfully at all the musings that never got from pen to page. Anthony's passion seemed to beam out in interviews from food to travel. In the 2019 article from EatThis.com, 51 Anthony Bourdain quotes and life lessons we'll never stop loving, writer Sarah Weingarten compiled a healthy amount of quotes from Anthony Bourdain over his life. While I can't be certain on these quotes' authenticity, I know that a Bourdain is within their DNA. No one seemed to have a certified fervor quite as he did, so I'm taking the liberty of transcribing these quotes with one caveat. I've replaced the word food with the word history. This is my funeral dirge to him, written by the man himself, with a little help. The following is a pseudo-plagiarized and ham-fisted homage to Bourdain and my love of history. Anyone who's a historian, who loves history, ultimately knows that all that matters is it good? Does it give pleasure? I personally think there is a real danger of taking history too seriously. History should be part of the bigger picture. People are generally proud of their history. For me, the learning of history has been a lifelong love affair, with moments both sublime and ridiculous. But like a love affair, looking back, you remember the happy times best. History may not be the answer to world peace, but it's a start. I think history, culture, people, and landscapes are all inseparable. History is everything we are. It's an extension of nationalist feelings, ethnic feelings, you personally, your province, your region, your tribe, your grandma. It's inseparable from those from the get-go. History is a craft, I like to think, and a good historian is a craftsman, not an artist. There's nothing wrong with that. The great cathedrals of Europe were built by craftsmen, though not designed by them. Expertly practicing your craft is noble, honorable, and satisfying. Bad history is made without pride by professors who have no pride and no love. Bad history is made by professors who are indifferent or trying to be everything to everybody, trying to please everyone. Bad history is fake history. History that shows fear and lack of confidence in people's ability to discern or to make decisions about their lives. So lift your Negroni to toast Tony. He still draws breath within our minds.
Calamity Jane. Calamity Jane is one of the most notorious figures of the Old West. A skilled sharpshooter equally adept in profanity, she was the embodiment of what many on the frontier considered unladylike. Legends say she rode with real cowboys. Her acquaintances include General Custer, Wild Bill Hickok, and Buffalo Bill Cody. She was also known to spread salacious dime novel-worth rumors about herself. In many ways, Calamity Jane was a legend of her own making. Calamity Jane's tale only grew after her death. She was a staple in Western films. Calamity Jane was born Martha Jane Canary in 1852 in Princeton, Missouri. According to a ghostwritten 1896 autobiography, Canary was born a poor pioneer girl to a gambling addict father and a mother who had worked as a prostitute. Her mother died while the family was en route to Blackfoot, Montana, when Canary was 14. The family lived in Virginia City, Nevada, for a time, and then her father died just a year later in Salt Lake City, Utah. Canary cared for her 5 younger siblings and traveled to Piedmont, Wyoming, in search of a better life. She got a taste of the Wild West lifestyle in Wyoming, working as a dance hall girl, ox team driver, and scout. Shortly after, Canary began working as a prostitute at the Fort Laramie 3-Mile Hog Ranch. By the mid-1870s, Canary was a real celebrity of the Wild West. Not content with merely staying inside the dance halls and brothels, Canary created a persona for herself. She became known for wearing what was considered men's attire, dressing in buckskins. Unlike the Old West saloon girls, Calamity Jane had no use for perceived femininity. 19th-century publications often described her as masculine and weather-beaten from her time riding the plains. In 1876, Canary arrived on Wild Bill's wagon in the gold mining town of Deadwood, South Dakota. The town's lawless ways and hard-living citizens suited her, and she became a frequent sight around the Deadwood saloons in Dakota Territory. Along with comrades such as Wild Bill and Charlie Utter, Canary rode out on stagecoach wagon expeditions in search of gold. Her nickname derived from her frequent claims of helping folks out of calamities. It's also possible that the local Deadwood paper coined the Black Hills Pioneer nickname, which announced Canary's arrival with the headline "Calamity Jane has arrived." Canary's reputation as the tough-talking, hard-drinking friend of Wild Bill Hickok is central to her legend. Wild Bill dressed Calamity in her signature buckskins when he found her nearly naked and extremely inebriated outside an army camp in Fort Laramie, Wyoming. Throughout her life, Canary claimed to be Wild Bill's lover, though most historians doubt the merit of her claims. Among the likely untruths of Calamity Jane's life, she claims to have gone after Hickok's murderer, Jack McCall, with a meat cleaver. Around 1885, Canary is said to have married a man whose last name was Burke and allegedly gave birth to a daughter in 1887. In 1941, a woman who went by Jean Hickok McCormick claims to be the daughter of Calamity Jane and Wild Bill Hickok. McCormick produced a diary and letters, supposedly given to her by Calamity Jane. But McCormick's claims and the veracity of the letters have been disputed by historians. In addition to her tough-as-nails persona, there was a softer side to Calamity Jane. She spent long hours in Deadwood nursing patients during a smallpox epidemic, and though she was often penniless, she didn't hesitate to help the poor and hungry. Toward the end of her life, Canary joined Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, known as Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, where her storytelling prowess could shine. Calamity Jane died in 1903, at the age of 51. She is buried at Mount Moriah Cemetery next to her old friend Wild Bill.
Catch wrestling. Catch as catch can, or catch wrestling, although its origins have been lost in history, is deeply rooted in Lancashire, England, and is considered the ancestor of modern professional wrestling and mixed martial arts competitions. In Old Lancashire English, catch as catch can is translated to catch me if you can. The British Navy exposed the young men of their day to many forms of grappling worldwide. They brought these techniques back to England, adding to the dangerous arsenal of catch wrestling submissions. In the late 1800s and early to mid-1900s, as part of local carnivals, catch wrestlers would take on all challengers as part of the athletic show, where locals could stand a chance to win cash if they could pin or submit to the carnival's wrestler. The catch wrestler had to prepare for the worst-case scenario with the unknown opponents stepping into the ring regularly, so quick and aggressive submissions were necessary. Submission wins were preferred so there would be no chance for a challenger to argue if the match was stopped prematurely. Often a challenger would argue with a referee over whether or not he was pinned, but the submission was always clear and decisive. Conditioning was also a primary weapon for a catch wrestler, who sometimes had to wrestle for several hours before winning a match. The rules of the early matches were determined by the wrestlers and would usually change from city to city. Negotiations could take forever. Often there were no time limits at all, with the winner having the best of 3 falls. Holds and locks could be taken anywhere on the body, and brutal throws were legal in the Lancashire style of catch wrestling. There are no points for a position in catch wrestling. The only ways to win a match are to pin or submit your opponent using one of the many fast and aggressive submissions. Generally, chokes were not permitted unless the match was agreed upon as an all-in contest or no holds barred. Taping out, yelling enough, or rolling to one back were considered a sign of defeat. The term no holds barred initially used to describe the wrestling method prevalent in catch wrestling tournaments during the late 19th century. No wrestling holds were banned from the competition, regardless of how dangerous they might be. In the late 19th century, catch wrestling made its way to North America and spread like wildfire. The North Americans already had a brutal rough and tumbled style of fighting, often referred to as brawling or gouging, where grappling, strangling, limb twisting, headbutting, punching, kicking, biting, and even eye gouging were legal. Somehow, as touring catch wrestlers passed through competing against the American brawlers, the two styles merged, giving birth to the more aggressive North American catch as catch-can wrestling. History has yet to record the names of many of the earliest catch wrestlers in England or America. These wrestlers participated in local carnivals or near coal mines or logging camps where they would take on all comers. Local wrestlers could earn cash for winning, but the carnival wrestlers were often better prepared. Not all matches were as rough and tumble. Amateur leagues featured tournaments that appealed to a more sophisticated crowd. For example, British wrestling champion Edwin Bibby fought in a match for Queen Victoria. He immigrated to America in 1879 and, 2 years later, beat Duncan C. Ross to become the first American heavyweight champion. Gotch and Hockenschmidt fought for 2 hours in Chicago in 1908 and held a rematch in 1911 in front of 30,000 spectators. Gotch defeated Hockenschmidt in each contest.
Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, fought on June 25, 1876, near the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory, pitted federal troops led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer against a band of Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Tensions between the two groups had risen since the discovery of gold on Native American lands. When several tribes missed a federal deadline to move to reservations, the U.S. Army, including Custer and his 7th Cavalry, was dispatched to confront them. Custer was unaware of the number of Indians fighting under the command of Sitting Bull at Little Bighorn, and his forces were outnumbered and quickly overwhelmed in what became known as Custer's Last Stand. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, leaders of the Sioux on the Great Plains, strongly resisted the mid-19th century efforts of the U.S. government to confine their people to Indian reservations. In 1875, after gold was discovered in South Dakota's Black Hills, the U.S. Army ignored previous treaty agreements and invaded the region. This betrayal led many Sioux and Cheyenne tribe members to leave their reservations and join Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse in Montana. By the late spring of 1876, more than 10,000 Native Americans had gathered in a camp along the Little Bighorn River the Greasy Grass in defiance of a U.S. War Department order to return to their reservations or risk being attacked. In mid-June, 3 columns of U.S. soldiers lined up against the camp and prepared to march. A force of 1,200 Native Americans turned back the first column on June 17. 5 days later, General Alfred Terry ordered George Custer's 7th Cavalry to scout ahead for enemy troops. On the morning of June 25, Custer, a West Point graduate, drew near the camp and decided to press forward rather than wait for reinforcements. At midday on June 25, Custer's 600 men entered the Little Bighorn Valley. Among the Native Americans, word quickly spread of the impending attack. The older Sitting Bull rallied the warriors and saw the safety of the women and children, while Crazy Horse set off with a large force to meet the attackers head-on. Despite Custer's desperate attempts to regroup his men, they were quickly overwhelmed. As many as 3,000 Native Americans attacked Custer and some 200 men in his battalion. Within an hour, Custer and all his soldiers died. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, also called Custer's Last Stand, marked the most decisive Native American victory and the worst U.S. Army defeat in the Long Plains Indian War. The demise of Custer and his men outraged many white Americans and confirmed their image of the Indians as wild and bloodthirsty. Meanwhile, the U.S. government increased its efforts to subdue the tribes. Almost all Sioux and Cheyenne would be confined to reservations within 5 years. Marcus Albert Reno was a United States military officer who served in the American Civil War, where he was a combatant in several significant battles, and later under George Armstrong Custer in the Great Sioux War against the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne. Reno is most noted for his prominent role in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where he did not support Custer's position on the battlefield, remaining in a defensive formation with his troops about 4 miles away. This event has since been a long-standing controversy regarding his command decisions during one of the most infamous defeats in the history of the United States military. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was the subject of an 1879 U.S. Army Court of Inquiry in Chicago, held at Reno's request, during which his conduct was scrutinized. The court found Reno's conduct to be without fault. Some testimony by non-army officers suggested that he was drunk and a coward. After the battle, Thomas Rosser, James O'Kelly, and others continued to question their behavior of Reno due to his hastily ordered retreat. Defenders of Reno at the trial noted that, while the retreat was disorganized, Reno did not withdraw from his position until it became apparent that he was outnumbered and outflanked by the Native Americans. Contemporary accounts also point to the fact that Reno's scout, Bloody Knife, was shot in the head, spraying him with blood, possibly increasing his panic and distress. General Terry and others claimed that Custer made strategic errors from the start of the campaign. For instance, he refused to use a battery of Gatling guns and turned down General Terry's offer of an additional battalion of the 2nd Cavalry. Custer believed the Gatling guns would impede his march up the Rosebud and hamper his mobility. Custer planned to live and travel like Indians. In this manner, the command will be able to go wherever the Indians can, he wrote in his Herald Dispatch. His rapid train en route to the Little Bighorn averaged nearly 30 miles daily, so his assessment appears to have been accurate. Each heavy, hand-cranked weapon could fire up to 350 rounds a minute, an impressive rate, but they were known to jam frequently. By contrast, each Gatling gun had to be hauled by 4 horses, and soldiers often had to drag the heavy guns by hand over obstacles. During the Black Hills expedition 2 years earlier, a Gatling gun had turned over, rolled down a mountain, and shattered. Lieutenant William Lowe, commander of the artillery detachment, was said to have almost wept when he learned he had been excluded from the strike force. Custer believed that the 7th Cavalry could handle any Indian force and that the addition of the 4 companies of the 2nd would not alter the outcome. When offered the 2nd Cavalry, he reportedly replied that the 7th could handle anything. There is evidence that Custer suspected he would be outnumbered by the Indians, although he did not know how much. By dividing his forces, Custer could have caused the defeat of the entire column had it not been for Bentine's and Reno's linking up to make a desperate yet successful stand on the bluff above the southern end of the camp. Custer's dividing his force into 4 smaller detachments, including the pack train, can be attributed to his inadequate surveillance. He also ignored the warnings of his Crow scouts and Charlie Reynolds. By the time the battle began, Custer had already divided his forces into 3 battalions of differing sizes, of which he had kept the largest. His men were widely scattered, and unable to support each other. Wanting to prevent any escape by the combined tribes to the south, where they could disperse into different groups, Custer believed that an immediate attack on the south end of the camp was the best course of action.
Mark Twain. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, known by his pen name Mark Twain, was an American writer, humorist, entrepreneur, publisher, and lecturer. He was lauded as the greatest humorist the United States has produced, and William Faulkner called him the father of American literature. His novels include The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and its sequel, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the latter of which has often been called the Great American Novel. Twain was raised in Hannibal, Missouri, which later provided the setting for Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. He served an apprenticeship with a printer and then worked as a typesetter, contributing articles to the newspaper of his older brother Orion Clemens. He later became a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi River before heading west to join Orion in Nevada. He referred humorously to his lack of success at mining, turning to journalism for the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise. His humorous story The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County was published in 1865, based on a story he heard at Angels Hotel in Angels Camp, California, where he had spent some time as a miner. The short story brought international attention and was even translated into French. His wit and satire, in prose and speech, earned praise from critics and peers, and he was a friend to presidents, artists, industrialists, and European royalty. Twain was born shortly after the appearance of Halley's Comet, and he predicted that he would go out with it as well, dying the day after the comet made its closest approach to Earth. Twain earned a great deal of money from his writings and lectures but invested in ventures that lost most of it. One is the Page Compositor, a mechanical typesetter that failed because of its complexity and imprecision. He filed for bankruptcy in the wake of these financial setbacks but, in time, overcame his financial troubles with the help of Henry Huddleston Rogers. He eventually paid all his creditors in full, even though his bankruptcy relieved him of having to do so. Twain's major publication was The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which draws on his youth in Hannibal. Tom Sawyer was modeled on Twain as a child, with traces of schoolmates John Briggs and Will Bowen. The book also introduces Huckleberry Finn in a supporting role based on Twain's boyhood friend Tom Blankenship. The Prince and the Pauper were not as well received, despite a storyline familiar in film and literature today. Twain had started Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which he consistently had problems completing, and had finished his travel book A Tramp Abroad, which describes his travels through Central and Southern Europe. The book tells the story of two boys born on the same day who are physically identical, acting as a social commentary as the Prince and Pauper switch places. Twain's subsequent major published work was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which confirmed him as a noteworthy American writer. Some have called it the first great American novel, and the book has become required reading in many schools throughout the United States. Huckleberry Finn was an offshoot of Tom Sawyer and had a more serious tone than its predecessor. 400 manuscript pages were written in mid-1876, right after the publication of Tom Sawyer. The last fifth of Huckleberry Finn is subject to much controversy. While Twain is often depicted wearing a white suit, modern representations suggesting that he wore them throughout his life are unfounded. Evidence suggests that Twain began wearing white suits on the lecture circuit after the death of his wife in 1904. However, evidence also shows him wearing a white suit before 1904. In 1882, he sent a photograph of himself in a white case to 18-year-old Edward W. Bock, later publisher of the Ladies' Home Journal, with a handwritten note. The white suit eventually became his trademark, as illustrated in anecdotes about this eccentricity, such as when he wore a white summer suit to a congressional hearing during the winter. McMaster's The Mark Twain Encyclopedia states that Twain did not wear a white suit in his last 3 years, except at one banquet speech.
Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell, best known for his invention of the telephone, revolutionized communication as we know it. While there's some controversy over whether Bell was the true pioneer of the phone, he secured exclusive rights to the technology and launched the Bell Telephone Company in 1877. Eventually, the gifted scientist held more than 18 patents for his inventions and worked in communications. His interest in sound technology was deep-rooted and personal, as both his wife and mother were deaf. Alexander Graham Bell was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, on March 3, 1847. Bell's father was a professor of speech elocution at the University of Edinburgh, and his mother, despite being deaf, was an accomplished pianist. Young Alexander was an intellectually inquisitive child who studied piano and began inventing things early. Both of his brothers passed away from tuberculosis by the time Bell was in his early 20s. Initially, Bell's education consisted of homeschooling. Bell didn't excel academically, but he was a problem solver from an early age. When he was just 12, the young Alexander invented a device with rotating paddles and nail brushes that could quickly remove husks from wheat grain to help enhance the farming process. At age 16, Bell began studying the mechanics of speech. He went on to attend Royal High School and the University of Edinburgh. In 1870, Bell, along with his family, moved to Canada. The following year, he settled in the United States. While in the United States, Bell executed a system his father designed to teach deaf children called visible speech, a set of symbols representing speech sounds. At age 26, the budding inventor became a professor of vocal physiology and elocution at the Boston University School of Oratory, even though he didn't have a university degree. In 1872, he opened the School of Vocal Physiology and Mechanics of Speech in Boston, where deaf people were taught to speak. While teaching, Bell met Mabel Hubbard, a deaf student. The couple married on July 11, 1877. They had 4 children, including 2 sons who died as infants. In 1871, Bell started working on the harmonic telegraph, a device that simultaneously allowed multiple messages to be sent over a wire. While trying to perfect this technology, backed by a group of investors, Bell became preoccupied with finding a way to communicate with human voice over wires. By 1875, Bell, with the help of his associate Thomas Watson, had come up with an uncomplicated receiver that could turn electricity into sound. Other scientists, including Antonio Meucci and Elisha Gray, were working on similar technologies, and there's some debate over who should be credited with the invention of the telephone. It's said that Bell raced to the patent office to be the first to secure the rights to the discovery. On March 7, 1876, Bell was awarded his telephone patent. A few days later, he made the first ever telephone call to Watson, allegedly uttering the now famous phrase, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want you." By 1877, the Bell Telephone Company, known as AT&T, was created. In 1915, Bell made the first transcontinental phone call to Watson from New York City to San Francisco. The inventor faced a nearly 20-year legal battle with other scientists, including Gray and Meucci, who claimed they created telephone prototypes before Bell's patent. Bell developed multiple techniques to help teach speech to the deaf and even worked with well-known author and activist Helen Keller. He also helped launch Science magazine and, from 1896 to 1904, served as president of the National Geographic Society. Bell died on August 2, 1922, at 75 in Nova Scotia, Canada. His wife and 2 daughters survived him. The cause of his death was difficulties with diabetes. During Bell's funeral, every phone in North America was silenced to pay homage to the inventor. Today, the famous scientist is remembered for his groundbreaking work in sound technology and improving education for the deaf. His best-known invention, the telephone, forever changed the way humans communicate with each other. Compromise of 1877. The Compromise of 1877 was an unwritten deal informally arranged among United States congressmen that settled the intensely disputed 1876 presidential election. It resulted in the United States federal government pulling the last troops out of the southern United States and ending the Reconstruction era. Through the compromise, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was awarded the presidency over Democrat Samuel J. Tilden on the understanding that Hayes would remove the federal troops whose support was essential for the survival of Republican state governments in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Hayes received 185 electoral votes to Tilden's 184 electoral votes. Despite losing the election, Tilden won the popular vote with 4,301,000 votes to 4,036,000 votes for Hayes. Under the compromise, Democrats who controlled the House of Representatives permitted the decision of the Electoral Commission to take effect. The exact terms of the agreement are somewhat contested as the documentation is lacking. The outgoing president, Republican Ulysses S. Grant, removed the soldiers from Florida, and as president, Hayes withdrew the remaining troops from South Carolina and Louisiana. As soon as the soldiers left, many white Republicans also left, and the Redeemer Democrats, who already dominated other state governments in the South, took control. Some black Republicans felt betrayed as they lost their power in the South that the federal military had propped up, and by 1905 most black people were effectively disenfranchised in every southern state. On January 29, 1877, President Grant signed the Electoral Commission Act, which set up a 15-member commission of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats to settle the disputed 1876 election. Since the Constitution did not explicitly indicate how electoral college disputes were to be resolved, Congress was forced to consider other methods to settle the crisis. Many Democrats argued that Congress should decide which certificates to count. However, the chances that this method would result in a harmonious settlement were slim, as the Democrats controlled the House while the Republicans controlled the Senate. Several Hayes supporters, on the other hand, argued that the president pro tempore of the Senate had the power to determine which certificates to count because he was responsible for chairing the congressional session at which the electoral votes were to be tallied. Since the office of president pro tempore was entertained by a Republican, Senator Thomas W. Ferry of Michigan, this method would have favored Hayes. Still, others proposed that the Supreme Court should settle the matter. In a stormy session that began on March 1, 1877, the House debated the objection for about 12 hours before overruling it. Instantly, another spurious objection was raised, this time to the electoral votes from Wisconsin. Again, the Senate voted to overrule the objection, while a filibuster was conducted in the House. However, the Speaker of the House, Democrat Samuel J. Randall, refused to entertain dilatory motions. Eventually, the filibusterers gave up, allowing the House to reject the objection in the early hours of March 2. The House and Senate then reassembled to complete the count of the electoral votes. At 4:10 a.m. on March 2, Senator Ferry announced that Hayes and Wheeler had been elected to the presidency and vice presidency by an electoral margin of 185 to 184. The Democrats agreed not to block Hayes' inauguration based on a backroom deal. Key to this deal was the understanding that federal troops would no longer interfere in Southern politics despite substantial election-associated violence against blacks. The Southern states indicated that they would protect the lives of African Americans. However, such promises were largely not kept. Hayes' friends also let it be known that he would promote federal aid for internal improvements, including help with a railroad in Texas, and name a Southerner to his cabinet. With the end of the political role of Northern troops, the president had no method to enforce Reconstruction. Thus, this backroom deal signaled the end of American Reconstruction. The compromise essentially stated that Southern Democrats would acknowledge Hayes as president, but only on the understanding that Republicans would meet specific demands. The following elements are generally said to be the points of the compromise. The removal of all remaining U.S. military forces from the former Confederate states. U.S. troops remained only in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida then, but the compromise completed their withdrawal from the region. The appointment of at least one Southern Democrat to Hayes' cabinet. The construction of another transcontinental railroad using the Texas and Pacific in the South. This had been part of the Scott Plan proposed by Thomas A. Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He had initiated negotiations resulting in the final compromise. Legislation to help industrialize the South and restore its economy following the Civil War and Reconstruction. The right to deal with black people without Northern interference. In exchange, Democrats would accept Republican Hayes as president by not employing the filibuster during the joint session of Congress needed to confirm the election. After the compromise, a few Democrats complained loudly that Tilden had been cheated. There was talk of forming armed units that would march on Washington, but President Grant was ready for that. He tightened military security, and nobody marched on Washington. Hayes was peacefully inaugurated. Points 1 and 2 of the compromise took effect. Before the election, Hayes had already announced his support for restoring Home Rule, which would involve federal troop removal. At the time, it was neither unusual nor unexpected for a president, especially one so narrowly elected, to select a cabinet member favored by the other party. Points 3 and 4 were never enacted. It is possible there was no firm agreement about them. Whether by informal deal or simply comforts already in line with Hayes' announced plans, talks with Southern Democrats satisfied the worries of many. This prevented a congressional filibuster that threatened to extend the election disputes resolution beyond Inauguration Day 1877.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.